Red states and blue states. If you had a chance to watch the presidential debates last night in Boca or have watched any television whatsoever in the last 2 years in the state of Florida, you'll recognize that politics in America are more polarized today than they have been since 1879, since around the end of the US Civil War. And in fact, we've become more and more polarized every year for over 30 years now. This graph by Nolan McCarty, who's a professor at Princeton University, shows polarization trends between Republicans and Democrats in the House and Senate since 1979. And as you can see at this point, we're reaching almost complete opposition in voting, which means that our leaders can agree on almost nothing, right? So you probably think, well, that's politics, right? That's how it's worked, that's how it's been, that's how it's always been. But the truth is, it's not how it's always been. And in fact, if you look back 150 years or so, you can see that we've actually enjoyed many decades where our leaders could come together in a bipartisan way and work effectively to solve our more difficult problems. But not today. Today we are on the verge of serious trouble, and it's happening at a time when our deficit increases $4.2 billion every day, right? Millions of Americans, possibly some of you, are in desperate need of jobs, of decent housing and nutritional food. Our education system is in a free fall, and in the state of Florida, 23% of children live in poverty. And the state is amongst the worst in violence and homelessness, in affordable housing, and in unemployment. And yet our leaders are too disdainful and too divided to really talk effectively about this. And you know why? Well, we really don't know why. So for the past 15 years or so, I've studied these kinds of conflicts, these stuck, protracted, long-term conflicts, by reading everything I could get my hands on in the science of intractable conflict. And then I put together this team. This is a group of multidisciplinary scholars who are interested in this kind of problem. Physicists, complexity scientists, psychologists, anthropologists. And we came together for several years and have been collecting data on these kinds of stuck conflicts. We've looked at case studies, archival data. We've done laboratory studies on moral conflicts. We've even created some interesting little computer visualizations and simulations to model it. And what I want to talk about tonight is what we've learned from that research that can help inform why we're so stuck. But most particularly, I want to talk about what applied mathematics has to tell us. So don't freak out. I'm going to just talk about one idea from applied mathematics, which is an idea called attractors. And here's an attractor. Attractors are simply patterns that mathematicians can see in data as they track something over time. And they're patterns that become very simple and stable and then resist change. I'm going to talk about what attractors can teach us about why we're so stuck in this country and about what you as Floridians and Americans can do to change this. Because we really think that attractors may shed some light on the essence of why we're so stuck. Why are we stuck? Is it party loyalty, or is it the lobbyist's fault, or is it big government, or is it big business? Why? Why are we so stuck? The truth is, it's all of these things and more, but unfortunately they don't list really nicely like this, but they tend to operate more like this, where different issues and elements kind of trigger and reinforce other issues so that it starts to become a very complex and kind of overwhelming problem, the split between the reds and the blues. And because complex problems like this make us crazy anxious, we really prefer to see them like this. This seems much easier to handle. You're the problem, right? Well, mathematicians have a name for this. They call very complicated problems that spread and interact over time and then collapse into certain patterns. They call them attractors, okay? And attractors, again, are when we move into or are attracted into a certain pattern. That's why we call them attractors. They actually draw us in to certain ways of thinking and feeling and acting that we start to repeat again and again, even if we don't want to do that. So we see these kinds of patterns with addicts in addiction, where people consistently return to the same kinds of behaviors over and over again. We see it in international conflicts, for example, in Israel-Palestine, where you see the same kinds of patterns wear on for years and years. You even see these kinds of patterns in chronic traffic jams in cities, where in some locations you always hit the same kinds of patterns, right? In Washington and in Florida and across this country, we are stuck in a pattern of how we think and feel and act towards them. The blues or the reds, you know, the people that are responsible for everything that's wrong in this country, them. That's what we're stuck in. But what's really important to understand about these patterns is that they're not caused by any one thing. They're caused by many things, such as what I listed up there, but most importantly, it's how those things kind of collapse and come together and then put powerful constraints on how we think and feel and act. We get sort of sucked into the gravity of these things, and it feels impossible to change. However, we have learned some things about where these attractors come from that we think that can help. So this is research by two political scientists, Paul Diehl and Gary Getz, who study something called the Correlates of War database. And this is a database from 1812 that looks at all kinds of interstate exchanges. And in that time, they've identified about 915 cases of international conflict. But of those, only 5% get stuck. And they drag on and on and on, sometimes for decades, sometimes for generations. And it's the study of this 5% that we've learned something particularly fascinating, which is that these types of conflicts, about 95% of them, erupt or begin within 10 years of what they call a political shock. So something major happens, an assassination, an overthrow, a coup attempt of a government, and then 10 years later, you see one of these conflicts emerge and then lock in and become entrenched for decades more, right? But that's not typically how we think. Typically, we'll see a war or a conflict break out, and then we'll say, well, what happened here? Something happened to trigger this conflict, but the truth is that something possibly had happened a decade before, some major event a decade before that sort of established the conditions. So let me give you an example. In 2011, the Arab Spring erupted, and as did the beginning of the current Syrian conflict, right? Well, what happened about 10 years before the Arab Spring? 9/11 happened exactly 10 years before, and then the American incursions in Iraq and Afghanistan. Now, does this mean that 9/11 and the wars caused the Arab Spring? No, that's not what we're saying. What we're saying is that it set the stage. It destabilized the Arab-speaking world sufficiently so that 10 years later, you see young people rising in the street and overthrowing governments on Twitter, right? A major change over that 10 years. All right, well, something very similar is happening in this country, we think. So pundits usually suggest that our current political quagmire, us being stuck, really started with Reagan, that it was the Reagan administration that triggered it. But if you look at 10 years before Reagan, what you see is a series of major political shocks that happened in this country. Assassinations, a huge anti-war movement, an anti-establishment movement. There were major shocks to our culture that 10 years later moved into the divide of reds and blues that we're trapped in today and that become increasingly more problematic. Okay, so what does all this have to do with attractors and change, and how can we possibly get out of this? Well, first it's important to know that you can't really force attractors to change, right? There's too many things that hold them into place to force them out. But there are some things that we can do, you and I, tonight, to begin to decrease the probabilities that we'll remain stuck and increase the probabilities that our leaders will be able to come together and work effectively. But first, it's important that you understand when these kinds of patterns change, right? Because not only do 95% of these long-term stuck conflicts begin within 10 years of a shock, but about 75% of them also end within 10 years of a political shock. So if you look back at the graph, you can see that in 1924, which was about 10 years after World War I, the shock of the war to end all wars, we began to enjoy a time when our leaders were really quite effective at coming together and solving problems together, right? What that means is that political shocks, crises, for example, like the recent financial and economic crises, can provide ideal conditions to end polarization and move us in a more positive direction. Now, we may not see the effects for years, and it doesn't guarantee that we'll change, but it sets the conditions. So, another thing that mathematics tells us that can help us determine whether we can change or not is something that they call the power of initial conditions. You know, mathematicians, they like to come up with these terms. Initial conditions. So what does that mean? All it means is when a new regime or a new system is established, like a new government or a new administration comes in, that the very first decisions that they make in that new administration really largely determine the future trajectory of it. The first decisions, the first actions that they take really determine its future. That means that whoever wins the election in 2 weeks has this unique but small window of opportunity to reset us, right? We are a nation that is stuck, has been in decline for decades, and we radically need our leaders to change course, to figure out how to work together across this divide. But it's going to require kind of radically different thinking. So this is what people like FDR and Nelson Mandela did after major crises. They reset the agenda. So imagine if on Wednesday, November 7th, after the next election, the president, whoever he may be, comes out and says, I'm going to propose a radical new approach to governance. And it requires the president, me, and the Congress to come together in the first 100 days and to come up with a vision and a mission and a set of clear objectives that will address the more serious challenges we face today. And we're required in the first 100 days to come up with that, and if we don't, then I'm required, and by executive order will trigger a shutdown of the government. Right? Can you imagine that? It would take full advantage of the current destabilizing place we're in due to the economic and financial crises and reset our course. Okay, so that's just an illustration of what leaders could do to try to take advantage of this time and change our direction. But what about you? What can you do, or I do? Because let's not fool ourselves. That this pattern, this us-them pattern that we're trapped in is not just a DC phenomenon. It takes place because of the things that you and I do in our homes and communities every day. Our acts and our deeds really contribute to this. But the good news is that what we found is that even very small changes in what we call control parameters, which are kind of our basic rules of behavior, small changes in those parameters can make a huge difference on whether or not we find our way out of this or not. So for example, realizing that the problems we face today in national security, economics, banking, education, these are extremely complex problems. And there are no simple solutions to these as much as we'd like them. In fact, any solution to these kinds of problems are going to be mixed. There's going to be good things about them and bad things about them in the short run and in the long run. And simply recognizing that will force us to require of our leaders that they be more transparent and clear and come up with solutions that are feasible and realistic and sustainable. So how do you do this? Well, tonight there are groups like Search for Common Ground and the National Issues Forum and the Public Conversations Project, which are community-based organizations working locally here in Florida and across the country to have conversations in communities with community members on these more difficult issues and to try to reintroduce a sense of nuance and complexity into their understanding of these issues that have become oversimplified and polarized. The only way that we're going to find our way out of these is if we recognize the complexity of the matters that we face. But one other thing that I would suggest that we do, which is simply pay attention to our own behaviors. Science tells us that something like 90 to 95% of our daily behaviors are automatic. the things we do without thinking, like taking a shower, driving a car, reacting to our kids, they're automatic. And many of those things really contribute to the divisions that we're in. So let me ask, when was the last time that you MSNBCers out here watched Bill Riley, not to scowl or ridicule Bill Riley, but to try to get a different perspective on an important issue? Or when was the last time you Foxers tuned into PBS with the same kind of intention? Now, these things may seem trivial, but they're basic. They're fundamental to who we are and how we interact as a nation, and they can add up across people and over time and really have a major impact on whether or not we escape this trap. The good news is that we are in a crisis. So ask not what your country can do for you, but think about what you might be able to do with this rare opportunity of a crisis. Thank you.